this is a really fascinating and fresh way of thinking about computation, to look at it from the standpoint of differences between people with and without autistic tendencies, autistic syndrome. And I'd just like to push this a little bit further, in a way extension of Barbara's question, to abilities beyond, a little different from playing games. So at one time, not so long ago, computers could not beat the very best chess players. Now they can. And indeed, even beyond that, they can beat humans at Jeopardy, which is really remarkable. But so far, at least, computers have not won the Nobel Prize in literature. Similar, now turn to persons with autism. I have played chess with a person diagnosed with autism, and had my lunch handed to me. Extraordinarily good chess player, and I think that, I don't know the empirical evidence, but the stereotype is that there are indeed people with autism who are very, very good at chess and at mathematics. My question is, do you think that a person with autism is ever going to win the Nobel Prize in literature? And do you think a computer might ever win the Nobel Prize in literature? That's a question for both.
I think we get into an area where I have views, but I want to hesitate. And the reason I want to hesitate is how much we don't know. Now, you're absolutely right about there being so-called idiots savants, rather prevalent, more prevalent than usual amongst people with autism. And sometimes one does get the sense that, it may not be right, that actually there are computational mechanisms ready and waiting to go on, for example, the mathematical abilities, calendrical calculators and others, that kind of has its own life. And I say that because the application of that to world knowledge and to common sense is a problem. So you can get people with mathematical abilities who don't understand what it is to receive change at a shop, because the application is presents a set of difficulties. Now, when you look at some of the most gifted people in terms of painting, my mentor, in fact, Professor Beata Hermelin, who's now died, studied idiots savants. She was herself a remarkable character, very interested in art and literature and autism. And so she studied some people, including those presenting most remarkable artistic drawings and paintings. And it is also remarkable that these are very different kinds. So some of them are highly particular and detailed, which is fascinating, but others much less so. And even they've had some people presenting poetry. Now, I just get lost at this point. I don't know. I don't want to say, no, they won't. In general, of people with autism, one would say there do seem to be restrictions in the nature of their imaginative capacities. But I really then want to go silent and say, well, I think we need to wait and see. And implicit in what I'm saying is, yes, this may challenge some of what I'm saying about the profound importance of interpersonal relations for creative symbolic functioning. I think there are various ways of dealing with that, but I better not go on. So it's a really interesting question where I hesitate to answer, except insofar as saying, yes, you do see people with these loculated skills, and chess is pretty loculated, alongside difficulties in common sense.
My answer to the second part, will computers or robots ever get the Nobel Prize in Literature? Ignoring for the moment the issue of whether they are eligible, which I actually don't know. Nobel may have never even thought about the possibility and thus not explicitly excluded them.
They have a postdoc.
Something like that, yeah. That may be possible. Sure. Why not? I have absolutely no doubts that, given enough time, perhaps a lot of time, computers, or rather embodied agents, robots, virtual agents or so, will equal and even surpass our abilities. No doubt. The thing is, this actually relates nicely to the question of the Turing test. The ingenuity of the Turing test is that it still shows us how much we are not there yet. I mean, nowadays there are chatbots which win this annual Nobel Prize competition for the machine that comes closest in fooling judges in a setup which equals the Turing test. And if you look at the transcripts of what is happening in these conversations, it is abysmal. I mean, it is just fascinating to see how not far you get when you use the current approach, which is used by these chatbots, and which is faking it, using essentially canned conversations, which nowadays have been accumulated through thousands and thousands of interactions and then processed through machine learning algorithms, but without putting an inch of actual understanding into the equation. But of course, I believe, based on all I know, that understanding is still a computational process. We just haven't figured it out very well. But once we're there, it is not inconceivable that we will have decent robotic or virtual interaction partners. And once we are there, it is not inconceivable that we will endow them with more and more creative abilities in order to make these conversations more interesting. Who knows, maybe a novel will come out of that.
One more. Okay, I'm not quite sure how to formulate this question, and so I want to make sure I've understood the implications of what you said, but it strikes me that the focus on computational ability and the similarities between how computers work and how autistic children and adolescents deal with social situations, you seem to have implied that there's almost a continuum when you take affective and emotional and social interactions into account between computers at one end and so-called ordinary humans, although I admit that's a kind of a large and difficult to categorize category, with perhaps autistic syndrome somewhere in between. Now that may be entirely wrong, and I may have sort of misunderstood the implications of what you're saying. But the question for me then is, does this change, or what are the implications of focusing on these similarities and differences for what it means to be human, for how we think about what it means to be human? How do we define what it means to be human, especially in terms of affective dimensions, social, interactional, and emotional dimensions? Because it does strike me that you really haven't talked about emotions. Even the analogy of scratching and itching is a physical sensation. So that's a question for both of you.
Yeah, feelings actually are shot through what I've been saying, although I haven't been explicit about them. That is the itching as a subjective state, and I think if you look at developmentally, the emotional relations between people are absolutely fundamental in this story as a basis for this non-inferential role-taking, this feeling for the other, and what I've been saying about the relations between ourselves and the environment, and ourselves and others. I think that the feeling, the difficulty is quite what we're doing. We've got to be very careful about separating off feelings from affect and cognition and conation, will, feeling and thought. I think it's one of the real problems about computational thinking is that they think that you can do that. You can separate off cognition. Vygotsky says, that every thought contains within itself a transmuted affective attitude to the bit of reality to which it refers. And I think this relative separation of thought from feeling and will is a developmental accomplishment, not a starting state. So feelings are really important, and in that sense, and one has to be really careful with this ethical dimension, there are things in terms of the organisation of social experience with feeling that I think children with autism have difficulty with. I'm not saying it's absent, I just think it's very fragile, this grip that you and I have on each other when we're engaged. The grip isn't there in the same way, and their organisation of experience is somewhat different. That has implications for their functioning, which has some formal similarity with the difficulties that computers have in virtue of the computers not having the feelings and so on. But one has to be very careful. Now, whether you want to say that something quintessentially human, going back to Kanner, the innate inability to have the usual biologically provided affective engagement. Now, there is a case to be said that to have depth of human experience, you need that. But none of us are going to want to say, you know, the children with autism don't have depth of experience, but they may have limitations in some areas, and indeed one can demonstrate that through studies that we've done, where certain aspects of self-experience, indeed other experience, self as well as other, seem to be relatively intact, and others are very shaky or kind of confused and all over the place. So that's how I think the analogy works.
I mean, the question of what is characteristic, what is unique about humans is actually a scientific question. It's something you can address with the tools of science, and something which has been addressed in very interesting ways. And you can study it even if you have, I think, a largely mechanistic worldview, which, as you may have guessed, I, of course, have. I mean, the idea of some kind of human essence, to my mind, died with Darwin. It is probably not very interesting to discuss per se in scientific terms anyway. But still, the question of what makes us human is very interesting. And there, I think, maybe a few surprises in store for us in the future. For instance, I think research on emotional agents, on effective robots, among other things, has shown that emotions are not necessarily the thing that is hardest to fake in a non-human agent. So we may want to be cautious of putting all our human essence in the emotional part. This is something which is out there in popular culture. It appears in every Hollywood movie about robots or aliens invading us. Human emotions, human caring are what makes us essential. But that may be quite easy to get to. It may be other faculties that set us further apart, which we perhaps do not understand as fully yet.
And on that point, I think I will end with a disagreement. I think something to do with caring for each other is actually central, not only to what it means to be human, but also in terms of understanding the course of human development.